Boys were disappearing outside Moscow, not in one place, not at one time, and not in a way that made sense. Some left home and never came back. Some vanished near railway stations. Some were last seen on ordinary streets, on ordinary days, in a country already beginning to fracture. No one saw a pattern, just separate cases, separate families, separate tragedies. There was no public monster, no nationwide panic, no face on television, just silence. And over time, that silence began to connect, because the person behind it was not acting once. He was doing it again and again, year after year, while the Soviet Union collapsed around him. His name was Sergey Golovkin, and before his case was over, he would become one of the darkest killers of the final Soviet era. To understand how this case lasted so long, you have to understand the world around it. These crimes began in the final years of the Soviet Union and continued into the collapse that followed. By the late 1980s, the system still looked intact from the outside. Police worked, reports were filed, offices stayed open. But underneath, things were already weakening. Then the country began to break apart. The Soviet Union collapsed. Institutions became unstable. Resources were stretched. Coordination was poor. This was not a world of instant data sharing. There was no national digital system quietly connecting one disappearance to another. Case files were stored on paper, in separate offices, across separate districts, under separate investigators. If one boy vanished in one area and another disappeared somewhere else months later, those cases did not automatically become one story. They became separate files, separate theories, separate tragedies, a runaway, an accident, a local crime. That was often how the cases were first understood. And that is how patterns survive. Not because they are invisible, but because the system sees them in pieces. By the time investigators began to understand that these were not isolated disappearances, too much time had already passed. And by then, the pattern was already real. The first known disappearances began in the mid-1980s. Not as a wave, not as a national emergency, just one case, then another. The victims were teenage boys. They disappeared from ordinary places, train stations, roads, familiar local routes. They were going somewhere or coming home, moving through spaces that felt routine and safe. That was what made the danger so hard to see. At first, no one was talking about a serial killer. Each case arrived as its own shock. A boy did not return home. A family waited through the night, then into the next day. Police considered the usual explanations: a runaway, an accident, a local crime. And because the cases were treated that way, the pattern stayed hidden. Some bodies were found later, not immediately, not always in a way that made the connection obvious. Different places, different times, different investigators. What looked like separate tragedies was slowly becoming a system of hunting. At first, there was no public monster, only missing boys, one after another. A biography that did not immediately invite suspicion. He worked as a livestock specialist. He moved through daily life like someone built for structure, not chaos. That was part of what made him so difficult to imagine. He did not look reckless. He did not look unstable. He did not look like the kind of man people would instinctively fear. He looked organized, quiet, functional. And that appearance mattered, because men like that are rarely the first to draw attention. He was not surviving on the margins. He was living inside normal life, working, moving, speaking, existing in ways that did not trigger alarm. But underneath that ordinary surface, There was a second life, controlled, hidden, deliberate. He understood how to separate what others saw from what he was actually doing. He kept order on the outside and used that order as cover. That is often what makes predators like this so hard to detect. Not theatricality, not visible madness, restraint. He did not look like chaos. He looked organized, ordinary, functional, and for years, that was enough. He did not act at random, he selected vulnerability. His victims were boys who could be isolated, approached, and removed from ordinary life without immediate resistance. That was the pattern. Not impulse, not chaos, selection. He looked for moments when someone was alone, moments when routine became exposure, a station, a road, a place between destinations. And once that moment appeared, he moved with control. He was not driven by sudden rage. He was working through a method. He chose places with fewer witnesses, places where movement drew less attention, places where distance worked in his favor. Isolation was not incidental. It was part of the design. That is what makes this case so disturbing. The most disturbing part was not only what he did, it was how methodical he was. This was not a single explosion of violence. It was a repeated cycle. He created his own controlled environment. He chose the space. He controlled the timing. He reduced the chance of interruption. The crimes did not happen by accident. They happened inside a pattern he kept building and repeating. That is why the danger lasted so long. Because repetition creates efficiency, and method creates silence. By the time anyone could see the shape of it, he had already been using the same logic for years. For years, the full pattern remained incomplete, not because the crimes were invisible, but because they were scattered. The cases were spread across time. One disappearance, then another months later, then another in a different setting. The victims did not all vanish under identical circumstances. The locations varied, the timelines varied, the immediate assumptions varied, and that made the larger picture harder to see. Families saw personal catastrophe, investigators saw individual files, local authorities saw separate incidents. What no one could immediately see was the system behind them. And the timing made that even worse. These crimes stretched across the end of the Soviet Union and into the chaos that followed. Institutions were weakening. Coordination was poor. Archives were fragmented. Information moved slowly. Different offices held different pieces. Different investigators followed different leads. And without a strong shared system, those pieces did not easily become one case. So the fear stayed local. One town, one family, one search, one file. Not a national pattern, not yet. Parents felt the terror immediately. Investigators felt the uncertainty. But neither always had enough to see a serial hunt taking shape across multiple years. That is why he lasted so long. He was not hidden by brilliance. He was hidden by fragmentation. Eventually, the number of cases became too large to dismiss as coincidence. What had once looked scattered began to feel connected. Investigators started going back through older disappearances, old files, old timelines, old assumptions, and this time, they were not looking at each case alone. They were looking for overlap, similar victims, similar circumstances, similar gaps in the story. The more they compared, the harder it became to ignore what was forming. Coincidences stopped looking like coincidences. Separate tragedies began to align. A pattern was emerging, not perfectly, but clearly enough to change the direction of the case. Years of scattered fear were finally becoming one investigation. And once that happened, the work became more focused. Investigators began narrowing the field, not to one name yet, but to a smaller circle of possibilities. They started thinking less in terms of isolated incidents and more in terms of repeated behavior. That shift mattered, because once a pattern is recognized, a predator stops looking invisible. He starts looking consistent. And with every review, every comparison, every old file pulled back into the light, the circle moved closer. In 1992, Sergey Golovkin was arrested. The turning point was not loud, not dramatic, not cinematic, but it changed everything. Until that moment, the case was still a pattern under construction. A series of investigators were only beginning to understand. After the arrest, the scale began to shift, because the man at the center of it did not look extraordinary. He looked like the kind of person people pass without remembering. An ordinary man was now tied to years of disappearances. And once investigators moved past the arrest itself, the story did not become narrower. It became deeper. Materials from the investigation, combined with his own statements, began to reveal how long this had been going on. Not one crime, not 1 year, not one isolated period of violence. A sequence, repeated over time. When he was finally arrested, the story did not become smaller. It became worse. What investigators uncovered was not a short burst of violence. It was a series that had stretched across years. Officially, Golovkin was convicted for multiple murders of teenage boys. And even that number was enough to place the case among the darkest serial murder investigations of the late Soviet and early Russian period. But the weight of the case was never only in the count. Behind every number was a separate family, a separate disappearance, a separate search, a separate stretch of waiting with no clear answer. This was not one season of fear, not one district, not one household living with uncertainty. It was a pattern that reached across years and left damage far beyond the crime scenes themselves. Because when a case lasts that long, it does more than destroy lives. It changes the way entire communities remember that time. And that is what made the scale so chilling. Not only the number of victims, but the length of the silence. The fact that it continued long enough to become part of the era itself. In the end, the case became more than the story of one killer. It became a symbol of how long evil can remain active inside the blind spots of a failing system. The case eventually reached the courtroom. By then, investigators were no longer dealing with a series of disconnected disappearances. They were confronting one of the darkest serial murder cases of the late Soviet and early Russian period. Golovkin was convicted and sentenced to death. In 1996, that sentence was carried out, and that gave the case a final historical weight few criminal investigations ever carry. His case ended not only with a sentence, but with a place in history. Sergey Golovkin became the last person executed in Russia before the country's moratorium on capital punishment. Sergey Golovkin did not operate in a world of strong connections. He operated in a world that was breaking apart. The old system was dying. The new one had not fully formed. And in that space between collapse and reconstruction, separate tragedies stayed separate for far too long. One missing boy, one family waiting, one file on one desk, then another, and another. Only later did the full shape of the case become visible. And that is what makes it linger. Not only the crimes themselves, but how long the pattern remained unfinished in the eyes of the system meant to stop it. The danger was real. The warning signs were real, but the system saw them too late. By the time everything was finally connected, too many families had already learned the same truth. A missing child can disappear into silence long before a country learns how to connect the dots.